The doctor's voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. I remember staring at the ceiling tiles, those ugly, water-stained squares, and thinking how strange it was that this might be the last thing I ever looked at. My blood pressure had dropped to something the nurse called incompatible with consciousness, which is a very clinical way of saying I was dying. And the whole time, my husband Brandon was 40 minutes away, sitting in a hospital waiting room with his ex-girlfriend, because her son needed the one thing that only I could give. My rare blood. My AB negative blood that shows up in less than 1% of the population. The blood that was currently draining out of me faster than they could replace it. I didn't find out about any of that until 3 days later, when I woke up in the ICU with tubes in both arms and my mother crying into a paper towel in the corner of the room. Brandon wasn't there. He sent a text that said, "So glad you're okay, babe. Had some things to handle." I stared at that message for a long time. Had some things to handle. While I was dying. While doctors were scrambling and my mother was being told to call family members. He had things to handle. That was 8 months ago, and I'm telling you this story now because I'm sitting in a house that isn't mine. Or rather, it is mine now, legally and completely, thanks to a woman I'd never met before the worst week of my life. And I need people to understand exactly what happened, because sometimes I still can't believe it myself. Let me go back to the beginning. Let me tell you about who I was before any of this, because that matters. It always matters. My name is Ashley. Ashley Marie Colton, though I'd been going by Ashley Hargrove for 4 years, ever since I married Brandon at a small outdoor ceremony in his parents' backyard in Naperville, Illinois. I was 31 years old. I had a good job as a senior accounts manager at a mid-sized logistics company downtown. I drove a 4-year-old Honda CR-V that I'd paid off early. I had a savings account, a 401k that I actually contributed to, and a credit score of 742 that I checked probably more often than was healthy. I was, by every external measure, a woman who had her life together. Brandon Hargrove was charming in that easy, effortless way that some men have, the kind of charm that makes you feel like the most interesting person in the room when his attention is on you. He was tall, sandy-haired, worked in commercial real estate, and had this laugh that could fill up a whole restaurant. We met at a friend's birthday party in Lincoln Park. He spilled a drink on my shoes within the first 10 minutes, and then spent the next hour apologizing in increasingly creative ways, finally offering to buy me any pair of shoes I wanted to replace them. I didn't take him up on the shoes, but I did give him my number. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. He did it at Navy Pier, which sounds cheesy, but it wasn't. It was October, almost no tourists, and he'd arranged for this tiny little string quartet to play near the water. I cried. My best friend Kayla cried when I called her from the Uber home. Even my mother, who had been skeptical of Brandon from the start, admitted it was a very thoughtful gesture. My mother's skepticism was something I always filed under overprotective mom behavior rather than actual red flags. Linda Colton had been suspicious of every man I'd ever dated, going back to my high school boyfriend. So when she'd say things like, "Ashley, I don't know, something about the way he talks about his past relationships," I'd smile and change the subject. I was good at that, changing the subject when it made me uncomfortable. Brandon had one significant ex before me. Her name was Stephanie. They dated for about 3 years in their late 20s, and from what Brandon told me, the breakup had been mutual. They'd wanted different things, grown apart, all the standard lines. He mentioned her maybe 4 times in the 2 years we dated, always casually, always in passing. She had a son named Tyler. Brandon said he wasn't Tyler's father, that Stephanie had gotten pregnant by someone else near the end of their relationship, which was actually part of why things fell apart between them. I accepted that explanation completely. Why wouldn't I? After the wedding, we bought a house in Downers Grove. A real house, not a starter home, 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, a backyard with an actual fence and a patio where I immediately put a string of Edison lights and a little herb garden. Our mortgage was $2,340 a month. We split everything 50-50. I thought that was fair. I thought a lot of things back then that I now understand differently. Brandon's family lived about 20 minutes away. His mother, Karen Hargrove, was the kind of woman who smiled with her whole face while her eyes were calculating something entirely different. She had opinions about everything: my cooking, my career choices, the way I decorated the guest room, the fact that we hadn't started trying for a baby yet, even though we'd been married for less than a year. Brandon's father, Gerald, was quieter but no less present. He'd built the real estate business that Brandon eventually joined, and he had the particular authority of a man who'd never been told no in a meaningful way. Brandon's sister Courtney was 26 and lived at home, and seemed to exist primarily to relay information between family members like a human telegraph. I tried hard with all of them. I brought food to every family dinner. I remembered birthdays. I sent Karen flowers on Mother's Day with a card that said, "To my second mom," which I meant genuinely, and which she posted on Facebook without tagging me. I drove to Gerald's office Christmas party even though it was an hour and a half in traffic, and Brandon had promised we'd go together, then bailed at the last minute because of a work thing. I stood in that conference room making small talk with his colleagues for 2 hours alone, telling everyone he was so sorry he couldn't make it, and smiling until my face hurt. I thought that was what marriage was: showing up, filling in the gaps, making it work. The first time I heard Stephanie's name spoken in a way that made something in my chest go cold was at Thanksgiving. We were at Karen's house, the whole extended Hargrove clan, maybe 20 people, paper turkey centerpieces and the smell of Karen's dry, over-seasoned stuffing that everyone pretended to love. I was in the kitchen refilling the gravy boat when I heard Courtney's voice from the hallway. "Does Ashley know Stephanie's back in town?" And then Karen's voice, low and quick, "Shh, not now." I set the gravy boat down very carefully. My hands were steady, but something in my stomach had shifted, like a table with one leg slightly shorter than the others. You don't notice it until you put something on it and everything slides. I walked back into the dining room. Brandon was laughing at something his uncle said. He looked up at me and smiled, and I smiled back. And I sat down, and we ate Karen's dry stuffing, and nobody said another word about Stephanie. But I thought about it later that night, lying in bed while Brandon snored softly beside me. "Stephanie's back in town." Such a small sentence, such a careful hush that followed it. I told myself it was nothing. Karen was dramatic. Courtney was 26 and loved a little family intrigue. It was nothing. I was so good at telling myself things were nothing. The next morning I made coffee and brought Brandon a cup in bed, the way I did every Saturday. He was already on his phone. He didn't look up right away, and for just a second, maybe 2 seconds, I saw something cross his face. Not guilt exactly, more like the expression of someone who has been caught in the middle of a thought they weren't ready to share. Then he looked up, smiled, said, "Morning, babe," and took the coffee. And I stood there in our bedroom in our house in Downers Grove, thinking that I was probably imagining things. I was not imagining things. The weeks after Thanksgiving moved in that strange, slow way that I've come to associate with denial, where everything looks normal on the surface and you go through your routines and you laugh at the right moments, and you tell yourself you're being paranoid. You're being one of those women who manufactures problems where there aren't any. I went to work. I made dinner. I watched TV with Brandon on the couch with my feet in his lap, and he'd absently rub my ankles the way he always did. And I'd think, "See? This is fine. This is us. This is real." But I started paying attention in a different way. Not snooping. I want to be clear about that because there's a distinction between surveillance and awareness. And what I was doing was the latter. I was simply noticing things I'd trained myself not to notice before. Like the way Brandon's phone was always face down now when it used to just sit screen up on the coffee table. Like the fact that he'd started taking calls in the garage, which he'd never done before. Like the Tuesday evenings that had started appearing in his schedule as client dinners. Always on Tuesdays, always vague, always running later than they should have for a business dinner with someone in commercial real estate. I told Kayla about it in early December, over coffee at her apartment in Logan Square. Kayla had been my best friend since college, and she was the kind of person who cut straight through whatever fog you were generating around a situation and handed you the clear, unpleasant truth with a gentleness that made it bearable. She listened to everything I said without interrupting, which was how I knew she was taking it seriously. "The phone thing alone," she said, wrapping her hands around her mug, "would have me asking questions." "I don't want to be that person," I said, "the suspicious wife who goes through her husband's phone." "There's a difference between being suspicious and being observant," Kayla said. "You're not imagining this, Ash. You have specific, concrete things that changed. That's not paranoia, that's data." I drove home from Kayla's with that word sitting in my chest like a stone. Data. I had data. I just didn't know what it meant yet. The confrontation, the first real one, happened on a Wednesday night in mid-December. Brandon came home from one of his Tuesday client dinners a full day late, which he explained by saying it had run long, and then he'd had an early breakfast meeting, so it just made more sense to stay at a hotel downtown. He said this casually, setting his overnight bag by the door, already reaching for the remote. Like it was nothing. Like that was a completely normal thing that husbands did. Something in me just snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, but something that had been stretched very thin for weeks finally gave way. "Brandon," I said, "who were you with last night?" He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as carefully arranged. "I told you, client dinner, the Peterson account." "Until the next morning." "It ran late, we grabbed drinks after. I had the Schomburg meeting at 7 a.m. I just explained this, Ashley." "The Peterson account," I repeated. "Which Peterson?" He blinked. Just once, but I caught it. "What do you mean, which Peterson?" "Dave Peterson. You've met him." "I've met him twice," I said. "At company events. Does Dave Peterson know Stephanie?" The silence that followed was maybe 4 seconds long. 4 seconds doesn't sound like much, but 4 seconds of a husband not immediately saying, "Who?" or "Why would you ask that?" is actually a very long time. "Where is this coming from?" Brandon said, and his voice had shifted into something I recognized as his conflict management tone, the one he used when he was trying to de-escalate a situation at work by making the other person feel like they were being unreasonable. "Courtney mentioned at Thanksgiving that Stephanie was back in town," I said. "Your mother shushed her, and now you're coming home a day late from a client dinner. So I'm asking, is Stephanie involved in whatever is going on with your Tuesday nights?" Brandon set the remote down very deliberately. He looked at me for a moment, and I could see him making a calculation. "Stephanie reached out to me a few months ago," he said. "Her son Tyler is sick. It's serious. She needed some support navigating some of the medical stuff, and I've been helping her out a little. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd react exactly like this." I stared at him. "You knew I'd react like this, so you hid it from me for months." "I wasn't hiding it. I was managing it. There's a difference." "There is no difference," I said, and my voice came out quieter than I expected, which sometimes happens when I'm more upset than I know how to express out loud. "Brandon, you've been lying to me for months. By omission, by misdirection, by inventing client dinners. That is hiding." "I wasn't with her last night," he said, and he looked me directly in the eyes when he said it, which, I have since learned, is something practiced liars do because they know that's what you're watching for. I believed him. God help me, I believed him. He told me the full story, or what he presented as the full story, sitting at our kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee between us, the way we used to sit when we had difficult conversations early in our relationship and were still learning how to fight fairly. Tyler was 6 years old. He'd been diagnosed with a rare blood disorder. He was doing okay, Brandon said, but the situation was ongoing and stressful for Stephanie. And because Brandon had been close to Tyler during their relationship, he felt a responsibility. He'd been helping with logistics, driving to appointments when Stephanie didn't have coverage, helping research specialists, occasionally sitting with her at the hospital. He swore nothing romantic had happened. He said he should have told me sooner and that he was sorry. He was so convincing. That's the thing about Brandon that I think about now with a kind of sick admiration, the way you might admire a magic trick even after you understand the mechanism. He was genuinely, beautifully convincing. He had a way of telling a version of the truth that was just true enough to feel real, with just enough self-reproach to make you feel like the relationship was salvageable, like he was a good man who had made a bad decision, rather than someone who had been systematically lying to you for months. "What does Tyler need?" I asked, because I am the kind of person who, even when I am hurt and suspicious and afraid, will ask about a sick child. Brandon's expression shifted into something that looked like relief and tenderness at the same time. "He may need a transfusion at some point," he said. "He has a really rare blood type. They're working on finding compatible donors." I remember nodding slowly. I remember thinking, that's terrible, that poor little boy. I remember feeling, underneath my anger and fear, a thread of genuine sympathy. A 6-year-old with a blood disorder. Whatever was happening between Brandon and Stephanie, Tyler hadn't asked for any of it. "I need you to be honest with me from now on," I said. No more hiding things. If you're going to be involved in this situation, I need to know what's happening." "Of course," Brandon said. "Absolutely. I should have come to you from the beginning. That's on me." He reached across the table and took my hand, and I let him, and we sat there in our kitchen in our house in Downers Grove, and I thought we'd turned some kind of corner. I thought the honesty had finally started. I was so wrong. The holidays came and went. Brandon was present in a way he hadn't been in months. Attentive, affectionate, home for dinner almost every night. We spent Christmas Eve at my parents' house in Oak Park, and Christmas Day with the Hargroves. Karen gave me a cashmere sweater in a color that didn't suit me at all, which I thanked her for warmly. Gerald shook my hand and told me I looked well. Courtney barely made eye contact with me, which I noted but didn't pursue. I was trying to extend goodwill in every direction. I was trying to believe that the worst was behind us. New Year's Eve, Brandon and I went to a party at his colleague's house in Elmhurst. We danced, we drank champagne, he kissed me at midnight, and I took a photo of us and posted it to Instagram with a caption about looking forward to what the new year would bring. 27 people liked it in the first hour. My mother commented a little heart emoji. I stared at that photo later, Brandon's arm around my shoulders, both of us mid-laugh at something, and tried to hold on to what it represented. We looked happy. We looked like two people who had gotten through a rough patch and come out the other side. January was quiet. February was quiet. And then, on a Friday evening in early March, I got a voicemail from Karen Hargrove that I've listened to so many times since then that I could probably recite it word for word. Her voice was carefully modulated, the way it always was when she was saying something she'd rehearsed. "Ashley, honey, I just wanted to reach out because I know Brandon has been talking to you about the situation with Tyler, and I wanted to make sure you understood how serious things have gotten. That poor little boy is in a really critical place right now. I hope you'll keep an open heart about all of this. Families support each other in hard times. I know you understand that. Give me a call when you get a chance." I stood in the kitchen holding my phone and read that message again. An open heart. Families support each other. I called Brandon immediately. "What does your mother mean by an open heart?" I asked when he picked up. A pause, shorter than the one in December, but present. "She's just being dramatic," he said. "Tyler had a rough week. Mom's worried." "She said things have gotten critical. What does that mean medically?" "He needs a transfusion," Brandon said. "They found a potential donor match. It's being coordinated." "Okay," I said slowly. "Good. That's good, right?" "Yeah," he said. "It's good." He came home that night with Thai food and a bottle of wine, and we watched a movie, and I told myself that Karen's call was just Karen being Karen, that dramatic, slightly ominous way she had of communicating that made everything sound like the opening of a soap opera. Brandon was handling it. Tyler was getting help. Everything was fine. 3 weeks later, I woke up in the middle of the night with a pain in my abdomen that I initially thought was a bad reaction to something I'd eaten. By 4 in the morning, I was on the bathroom floor, and Brandon was calling 911, and by the time the paramedics arrived, I was barely conscious. An ectopic pregnancy I hadn't known about had ruptured. I was hemorrhaging internally. I had AB negative blood, which the ER team flagged immediately as a critical complication because the supply at the hospital was dangerously low. What I didn't know, lying on that gurney in the emergency department while my blood pressure dropped, and the nurses moved around me with the particular focused urgency of people trying to prevent something irreversible. What I didn't know was that 3 days earlier, a significant portion of the regional AB negative blood supply had been directed toward a private transfusion arrangement for a 6-year-old boy named Tyler, and that the person who had facilitated that arrangement, who had made the calls and signed the forms and ensured that the blood got to where it was going, was my husband. I didn't know any of that yet. I was just dying in a hospital 40 minutes from where Brandon sat in a waiting room, his phone face up on the plastic chair beside him, watching the doors. I woke up on a Tuesday. That's the first thing I remember with any clarity, someone telling me it was Tuesday and thinking that I'd lost 4 days somewhere, that they had simply ceased to exist for me while the rest of the world kept moving. The ICU at Elmhurst Hospital had a particular quality of light, that flat, bluish white that exists outside of any natural time, so you can never tell if it's morning or midnight just by looking at the room. My mother was asleep in the chair by the window, her head tilted at an angle that was going to hurt when she woke up. There were machines. There were tubes. There was a dull, thick ache across my entire lower abdomen that I later learned was what the inside of your body feels like when it's been opened and stitched back together. The nurse who came in first was named Patricia. She was maybe 50, with close-cropped silver hair and the efficient, unhurried manner of someone who had seen everything and was not going to pretend otherwise. She checked my vitals, adjusted something on the IV pole, and then looked at me with the kind of direct, assessing eye contact that nurses use when they're trying to figure out how much you can handle. "Welcome back," she said. "You had us nervous for a little while." "How long?" I asked. My voice came out strange, thin and papery like an old receipt. 4 days. You came in Friday morning. It's Tuesday now." She paused. "Your husband has been in and out. Your mother hasn't left." I filed that away somewhere quiet and deep and didn't take it out again until I was stronger. My mother woke up 20 minutes later, and the way her face changed when she saw my eyes open, that raw, unguarded relief, made my own eyes fill up immediately, which hurt because apparently crying when your abdominal wall has been through what mine had been through is an experience. She was across the room and holding my hand before I could say anything, pressing her forehead against the back of my knuckles and making a low sound that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite anything else. Just the sound a person makes when something they were terrified of didn't happen. "Hi, Mom," I said. "Don't you dare do that to me again," she said into my hand. Brandon arrived at 11. He walked in with a coffee carrier, 2 cups, and stopped when he saw that I was awake and that my mother was still in the room. Something crossed his face. I was getting better at reading what crossed his face by then, 4 days of nearly dying having clarified certain things for me. "Babe," he said, and his voice was warm and his eyes were wet, and he came to the side of the bed and leaned down and kissed my forehead, and I let him, because I didn't have the strength for anything else yet. "God, Ashley, you scared me so much." "Did I?" I said. My mother made a small sound and stood up, saying she was going to find the cafeteria, which we all understood meant she was giving us the room but was not going far. She touched my shoulder as she passed and gave Brandon a look that I didn't fully catch but that I could feel, the way you feel weather changing before you see it. Brandon sat in the chair she'd vacated. He put one of the coffees on my tray table, even though I had 1,000 things going into my veins and probably wasn't cleared for coffee yet. But that was a Brandon kind of gesture, the right shape of thoughtful without quite the right content. "What happened?" I asked. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" He told me about the ectopic pregnancy, the rupture, the internal bleeding. He described the paramedics and the ER and the surgery in the careful, spare language of someone recounting something they found upsetting to look at directly. And then he stopped, and there was a silence, and I said very quietly, "Tell me about the blood." The silence that followed that sentence was different from his other silences. Longer, denser, the kind of silence that has weight. "They had some supply challenges," he said. "The ER team managed it, you're okay." "Brandon." I looked at him, just looked at him. "Tell me about the blood." He set his coffee down, he looked at his hands, and then he told me, in a voice so controlled it was almost mechanical, that 3 days before I went to the ER, he had facilitated a private transfusion arrangement for Tyler using a portion of the regional AB negative supply. That he had made some calls, that he knew a hospital administrator through his real estate connections, that Tyler had been in a crisis, and that Brandon had used his contacts to ensure the blood got where it needed to go as quickly as possible. That he hadn't known I was going to need it, that he couldn't have known. I listened to all of it without speaking. My hands were very still on the blanket. "You redirected the blood supply," I said when he was done. "I facilitated a legitimate medical arrangement." "You redirected the blood supply," I said again. And then 3 days later I was bleeding out in an ER where the nurses had to call 4 hospitals to find enough AB negative to keep me alive. "Did they tell you that? Did they tell you that they had to make 4 calls?" His jaw tightened. "I didn't know that. But you know it now. Ashley, I was trying to save a child's life. And you nearly ended mine." My voice was still quiet. I don't know where that quiet came from, Something beyond anger, maybe. Something that had gone past the place where volume matters. You knew Tyler might need a transfusion. You knew I was AB negative. You had that information and you used it for him and you didn't tell me. You didn't give me the choice. You would have said no, he said, and the honesty of that sentence was somehow the worst thing he'd said yet. He knew. He knew I would have said no, so he just didn't ask. My mother came back from the cafeteria 45 minutes later to find Brandon gone and me staring at the ceiling, dry-eyed, doing the particular kind of thinking that feels like something solidifying. She sat down without asking what had happened and took my hand again, and after a while she said, "What do you need?" "I need a lawyer," I said. "Not yet, but soon." She didn't ask any questions. She just nodded, and that was when I understood that Linda Colton had been waiting for this moment for 4 years, and that she was going to be very, very useful. The next few days in the hospital were a strange, suspended kind of suffering. My body was healing at the pace bodies heal, slowly, painfully, with setbacks and small victories that the nursing staff calibrated carefully. Patricia became something of an anchor. She had a way of checking on me that wasn't intrusive, that gave me information, and then left me space to process it, which was what I needed because I was processing an enormous amount. The loss of the pregnancy, which I hadn't even known about, which somehow made it more disorienting, not less, sat alongside everything else in a way I couldn't quite organize yet. There was grief I didn't have room for. I put it somewhere I could find later and focused on what I could control. Brandon visited every day. He brought flowers once, food twice, his parents once. That visit, with Karen and Gerald arranged at the foot of my hospital bed, with their careful expressions and their expensive clothes, was one of the more surreal experiences of my life. Karen held my hand and said she was so relieved I was recovering. Gerald said the same thing he always said, which was that I looked well, which was medically inaccurate, given that I had recently nearly died, but I understood it as the only register he had. I was pleasant. I was gracious. I gave them absolutely nothing. Courtney didn't come, which I noted. On the 5th day, a woman knocked on the open door of my hospital room and said, "Ashley Hargrove? My name is Ruth. Ruth Calloway. I'm sorry to bother you. One of the nurses said it would be all right to stop in for just a moment. I can come back if this isn't a good time." She was maybe 75, small and straight-spined, with white hair cut short and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She was wearing a tan blazer and carrying a tote bag from the Art Institute of Chicago. She looked, in a word, precise. I had no idea who she was. "Come in," I said, because I was bored and in pain and starved for any human interaction that wasn't either medical staff or my husband performing concern. She sat in the chair beside my bed, set her tote bag on the floor, and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as appraising, not unkind, but thorough. Like she was reading something. "I was a patient here last week," she said. "I'm in the room 2 doors down, actually. I'm still here, they're fussing about my heart. I heard what happened with you. Not details," she added quickly. "Just that there was a young woman in a crisis and that there were some complications with blood supply. The nurses talk. I hope you don't mind." "I don't mind," I said. "I'm AB negative," Ruth said. "Have been all my life. It used to terrify me before they explained the donation system. I became a dedicated donor for 30 years. She paused. "I heard you nearly didn't make it." "I nearly didn't," I agreed. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Are you all right?" "Not medically. Actually all right." Something about the directness of it, the way she separated the medical from the actual, made my throat close. I hadn't cried since I woke up. I hadn't had the space for it, or the safety. But something about this precise, white-haired stranger asking the right question in the right way broke something loose. "No," I said, "I'm really not." Ruth Calloway nodded slowly, as if this was the answer she'd expected and was prepared for. She reached into her tote bag and pulled out 2 things, a small packet of tissues, which she set on my tray table, and a business card, which she held between 2 fingers before placing it beside the tissues. "My attorney's number is on the back," she said. "I wrote it there this morning. I don't know your situation, but I know the look of a woman who has just realized that the people around her are not who she thought they were. I've worn that look myself, a long time ago." I picked up the card. The front said Ruth Eleanor Calloway and had an address in Lincoln Park that I recognized as one of the nicer streets. The back had a name and number written in precise, even handwriting. Daniel Okafor, Family Law. I started. You don't have to do anything with it, Ruth said, standing and picking up her tote bag. But keep it. That's all I'm asking. She paused at the door. I'm going to be here for a few more days. 2 doors down. If you want company that isn't asking you how your pain levels are on a scale of 1 to 10. She left before I could say anything else. I held the card for a long time, reading both sides, reading them again. Then I slid it under my pillow, which seemed like the right place for it. Close, hidden, mine. That night, after my mother had gone to the hotel she was finally letting herself stay in now that I was stable, and after Brandon had texted to say he'd be by in the morning, I lay in the dark of my hospital room and I made a list in my head. Not a dramatic list, not a revenge list, a clear-eyed, practical list of what I knew, what I needed to know, and what I was going to do about it. I had a 742 credit score. I had a job I was good at. I had a mother who would not leave my side. I had a card under my pillow with a family law attorney's name on it. And I had, for the first time since I'd woken up in this room, a very specific and actionable anger, the kind that doesn't burn hot and wild but runs cold and steady, like water finding its level. Brandon had made a choice. He had weighed Tyler's life against mine and made a choice without asking me. And then he had sat in a waiting room while I nearly died and sent me a text that said he'd had things to handle. I was going to handle some things too. My phone was on the tray table. It was just past midnight. I picked it up and opened the browser and typed in the name Daniel Okafor, Family Law, and read his firm's website for 23 minutes in the blue light of the hospital room while the machines beeped their slow, steady rhythms around me. Then I set the phone down, closed my eyes, and for the first time in days, slept without dreaming. I was discharged on a Thursday, 11 days after I'd been admitted. Patricia walked me out to the entrance herself, which she didn't have to do, and when she hugged me at the sliding doors, she held on for just a second longer than a professional goodbye requires. I didn't say anything. Neither did she. Some things don't need words. My mother drove me home to Downers Grove in her Subaru, and the whole way I sat in the passenger seat watching the Illinois suburbs scroll past the window, the strip malls, the subdivision signs, the bare March trees, and I thought about Daniel Okafor's name written on the back of Ruth Calloway's card, which was in my coat pocket, which was in the bag in my mother's back seat. I'd looked up his firm from my hospital bed. 12 years in family law, board certified, offices in the Loop. I had his number memorized by then. I am good at memorizing things I need. Brandon was at the house when we arrived. He'd cleaned, really cleaned, vacuumed and wiped down and put fresh flowers in a vase on the kitchen table, and he'd made soup, which was sitting in a pot on the stove. He looked at me with an expression I recognized as carefully calibrated tenderness, and he took my bag from my mother with a thank you that was slightly too warm, and my mother looked at me over his shoulder with an expression that said, clearly and without any words at all, "Your call, Ashley. Your timeline. I've got you." She stayed for 4 days. She slept in the guest room with the door open, and she made coffee every morning, and she was, in the way that Linda Colton has always been in a crisis, the most stabilizing presence I have ever known. Brandon was on his best behavior the entire time. Attentive, present, cooking dinner, rubbing my feet. I watched him do all of it, and I felt nothing except a kind of clear, cold clarity that I was careful not to let show on my face. I called Daniel Okafor on a Tuesday morning in late March, 6 days after my mother drove back to Oak Park. Brandon was at work. I sat at the kitchen table, our kitchen table, with the fresh flowers that had wilted and hadn't been replaced, and I called the number on the back of Ruth's card and made an appointment for the following Friday. The paralegal who scheduled me had a calm, matter-of-fact voice that I found deeply reassuring. She asked if I needed the address. I told her I already had it. Daniel Okafor was not what I'd expected, though I couldn't have told you what I'd expected exactly. He was maybe 45, trim, with reading glasses he kept taking on and off, and he had the particular quality of attention that the best lawyers and the best doctors share, the kind that makes you feel like, for the duration of this conversation, your problem is the only problem in the world. His office was on the 31st floor of a building on Wacker Drive, and the view was Lake Michigan and the sky was the flat gray of an Illinois spring, and I sat across from him and told him everything. He listened. He took notes. He asked precise, specific questions about the blood arrangement, about the hospital administrator contact Brandon had mentioned, about the timeline of the Tuesday client dinners, about the financial structure of our marriage, about whose name was on the mortgage, about the 401k, about the joint accounts. I answered everything. I had been preparing for this conversation for 2 weeks. When I was done, he took his glasses off, set them on the desk, and looked at me. "What you're describing," he said, "with the blood diversion, that's potentially actionable beyond the divorce. Not in a criminal sense, necessarily, but there may be civil liability depending on how that arrangement was structured and documented. I'd want to look at it more carefully. Do you know the name of the hospital administrator he contacted?" "Not yet," I said. "But I will." He looked at me steadily. "You've thought about this a great deal." "I've had time," I said. "I nearly died." "Yes," he said, "you did." He picked up his pen again. "I want to be honest with you about what divorce litigation looks like in Illinois. It's not fast, it's not cheap, and it's not painless. Your husband works in commercial real estate. His income may be structured in ways that require forensic accounting to fully document. The house is jointly titled. The 401k has 4 years of contributions. This is going to take time." "I know," I said. "I'm not in a hurry. I'm in the right." Something shifted in his expression, just slightly. Not unprofessional, more like the look of someone who has been doing difficult work for a long time and occasionally encounters a client who makes it feel worthwhile. "Then let's get started," he said. What happened over the following 4 months I can only describe as the education I didn't know I needed. I learned things about my own marriage that I had been systematically protected from knowing, not through ignorance exactly, but through the particular kind of willful comfort that makes you not ask questions whose answers might disturb you. I learned, through the forensic accountant Daniel brought in, that Brandon had been withdrawing cash from our joint account in amounts just under the reporting threshold. 200 here, 300 there, going back 18 months. I learned that the Peterson account he'd cited as his cover for the Tuesday nights didn't exist in any of the company's documented client files for that period. I learned, through a source I will not name because I promised not to, that the hospital administrator who had facilitated the blood arrangement had done so as a personal favor, off the books, undocumented in any official capacity, and that Brandon had leveraged a real estate deal to secure that favor. That last part was the one that made Daniel go still for a moment and then say, very carefully, "That changes some things." I also learned, through methods that were entirely legal and that Kayla helped me with because she works in data analytics and is frighteningly good at finding information, that Brandon had been with Stephanie on the night he told me he was staying at a hotel downtown. The hotel receipt was in his email, which I had access to because we shared a family plan, and he had never changed the password from the one he'd set up on my phone 4 years ago. The hotel was in Evanston. Stephanie lived in Evanston. I printed that receipt. I put it in a folder. I put the folder in a box that I kept at Kayla's apartment because I had started thinking very carefully about what I wanted to do with what I knew, and when, and how. I did not want to do it badly. I had one shot at this and I was going to take it correctly. The confrontation happened on a Saturday afternoon in early July. I had chosen the timing deliberately. Brandon's parents were coming for dinner that evening, which meant he couldn't leave, couldn't escalate, couldn't do anything that would require explanation to his family. I had also chosen to have my mother there, and Kayla, because I was not going to do this alone and because I wanted witnesses. Brandon walked in from the garage at 2:30 in the afternoon to find the 3 of us sitting at the kitchen table. My mother had made tea that nobody was drinking. Kayla had her laptop. I had the folder. He stopped in the doorway. Something moved across his face. Surprise, then the beginning of the careful rearrangement. "What's going on?" he said. His eyes went to Kayla, then to my mother, then to me. "Sit down, Brandon," I said. He sat. I will give him that, he sat, which took a certain amount of nerve or a certain amount of calculation, and with Brandon I was never entirely sure which was operating at any given moment. I opened the folder. I set the hotel receipt in front of him. Evanston, I said. March 14th. The night you told me you stayed downtown because of an early meeting. He looked at it. He didn't touch it. Ashley. I'm not done, I said. This is also the forensic accounting summary from the past 18 months of our joint account. I set that down. And this is a documented timeline of the blood diversion arrangement, including the real estate connection to the hospital administrator, which my attorney has reviewed and considers potentially actionable. I set that down. And this is a statement from your company's client records showing that the Peterson account had no active engagements during the period you cited it as a reason for your Tuesday nights. The room was very quiet. My mother's hands were folded on the table. Kayla had her eyes on Brandon with the particular focused attention of someone who has been waiting for this moment for months and is not going to miss any of it. Brandon looked at the documents. Then he looked at me. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was deciding which version of himself to deploy. You've been building a case, he said. Yes, I said. I have. How long? Since the night I came home from the hospital and you sat in that chair and told me you'd facilitated a blood arrangement and that you didn't tell me because you knew I'd say no. I looked at him steadily. That was the moment I understood who you actually are. Ashley, I was trying to save a child. Don't. My mother's voice, quiet and absolute. Brandon looked at her, startled. Linda Colton did not look away. Don't do that in front of me. I know exactly what you did and why you did it, and it was not primarily about that child. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Brandon looked from my mother to Kayla to me, and I could see him doing the math. The house, the accounts, the attorney, the documents, the witnesses, his parents arriving in 4 hours, and I watched him land somewhere that looked, for the first time, like the actual truth. What do you want? He said finally. I want a divorce, I said. I want my name off the mortgage and my equity paid out. I want the full value of my 401k contributions. I want the joint account balanced from the cash withdrawals, which amounts to approximately $11,400 over 18 months. And I want you to acknowledge in writing, with your attorney present in mind, exactly what the blood arrangement was and how it was structured, because I have a right to that record. He stared at me. The acknowledgement, that could expose me to liability. Yes, I said, it could. Then why would I? Because the alternative, I said, is that I give everything I have to Daniel Okafor and we do this the long way, which will cost us both more money, more time, and considerably more exposure. What I'm offering you is a path that's painful but contained. I paused. I'm not offering it out of kindness. I'm offering it because I want this over so I can move on with my life. But I need that acknowledgement. I need it on record. Because a 6-year-old boy's medical history intersects with my medical history, and someday, maybe not now, maybe not soon, that record might matter to someone. Maybe to Tyler, maybe to me. I don't know, but I need it to exist. Brandon was quiet for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and stopped. He looked down at his hands. Okay, he said. It was not a dramatic word. It was a very small word for the size of what it meant. But I had learned by then that the most significant moments rarely announce themselves with appropriate fanfare. They arrive quietly, the way a diagnosis does, or a dawn, or the understanding that something you thought was the foundation of your life was actually just a floor, and the floor was never as solid as you believed. Karen and Gerald arrived at 6 o'clock to find the dinner table not set, and Brandon's face arranged in the careful neutral of someone who had recently had a very significant conversation and was not going to share it yet. My mother and Kayla had left an hour earlier. I had changed clothes because it seemed like the kind of day that warranted changing clothes. Karen looked around the kitchen. Is everything all right? Brandon and I have some things to discuss with you, I said. Why don't we sit down? That conversation I'm not going to recount in detail because it belongs to a part of this story that is about them more than about me, and I've spent enough time in that particular room. What I will say is that Karen cried, which surprised me, not because she was sad for me, but because she was frightened. I could see that clearly. The fear underneath the tears, the understanding that something she had managed and protected and arranged was now beyond her management. Gerald said very little. He looked at Brandon with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something that might have been disappointment, and that mattered to Brandon more than anything I'd said, which told me something about him that I'd always half known. Courtney called me the next day. She said, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you. About Stephanie, at Thanksgiving. I should have." "Yes," I said. "You should have." "Are you going to be okay?" "Yes," I said, and I meant it. Ruth Calloway was discharged from Elmhurst Hospital 2 days after I was. I didn't know that until she called me in April, using the number I'd written on a piece of hospital stationery and left with the nurses' station for her. We met for lunch at a restaurant in Lincoln Park, a quiet Italian place that she clearly knew well because the host called her by name and gave her a corner table without being asked. She was dressed the same way she'd been in the hospital, precise, clean-lined, a blazer, except now there was color in it, a deep blue that suited her. We talked for 2 hours. She told me about her own marriage, 30 years ago, to a man who had been charming and convincing and had made choices that put his interest before hers in ways that took her a long time to name clearly. She told me about the years after, which had been hard, and then had been good, and then had been very good. She had a house in Lincoln Park and a summer place in Michigan, and a collection of mid-century furniture that she described with the particular affection people reserve for things they chose entirely for themselves. She had no children by choice, and no regrets about that choice. She had friends and work she cared about. She'd spent 20 years on the board of a literacy nonprofit, and a life that sounded, genuinely, like one she had built deliberately and inhabited fully. Somewhere in the second hour, over coffee, she looked at me with those sharp eyes and said, "I'd like to show you something. Are you free next Thursday?" The something she wanted to show me was her house. Not to sell, she was very clear about that, but because she said she'd been thinking about what came next for her, and that she'd been thinking about it since the hospital, and that she'd like to talk about it with me specifically, because she had a sense about people, and her sense about me was that I was the kind of person who understood the value of a thing without needing to be told what the value was. I walked through Ruth Calloway's house on a Thursday afternoon in late April, and it was everything her tote bag had suggested it would be. Precise, beautiful, full of light and considered choices. Original hardwood floors. A kitchen that had been updated with the kind of restraint that costs more than extravagance. A garden in the back with a stone path that she'd laid herself, she told me, 20 years ago, one stone at a time. "I'm 76, she said, standing in the kitchen while I looked at the garden through the window. "My heart is not what it was. My attorney, Daniel, you have his card, has been helping me think through some estate planning. I don't have family to leave things to. I have friends and a few causes I care about, and I've been trying to figure out how to do this in a way that reflects what I actually value." I turned from the window and looked at her. "Ruth, I'm not making a decision today," she said. "I'm not making any decision under any pressure, but I want you to know that I've been thinking about you since that hospital room, about what you said when I asked if you were all right. You said no, just no. And I thought, that is someone who tells the truth even when it costs her something. That's rarer than AB negative blood." I laughed at that, a real laugh, the first real one in months. It surprised me, the way real laughter sometimes does when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time. What happened over the following months was slow and careful and entirely on Ruth's terms, which I respected completely. We had lunch. We walked through the Lincoln Park Conservatory on a rainy May afternoon. She came to my apartment in Wicker Park. I'd moved in March, a one-bedroom with good windows and a coffee shop below. And I made dinner and she brought wine, and we talked until 11 o'clock about books and work and what it meant to build something that lasted. Daniel Okafor was her attorney and mine, which created a clarity that both of us appreciated. He made sure everything was documented, reviewed, and clean. There was no ambiguity and no pressure, just two women who had found each other in a hospital room and discovered over time that they made sense together in a way that was hard to explain but easy to feel. The divorce was finalized in September. I walked out of the courthouse on a Tuesday morning, always Tuesdays, I thought, with a private irony, with a settlement that gave me my equity, my 401k, the cash withdrawal reimbursement, and the written acknowledgement of the blood arrangement that I had asked for. Brandon's attorney had tried twice to remove the acknowledgement from the settlement terms. Daniel had declined both times, with a calm that I found deeply satisfying. It stayed in. Brandon signed everything on a Thursday. I wasn't in the room. My attorney called me when it was done and said, "It's final." And I was sitting in Ruth's garden at the time, on the stone path she'd laid one stone at a time, and I said, "Thank you, Daniel," and hung up and sat there for a while in the September afternoon, with the sound of the city around me and the feeling of something heavy finally, completely setting down. Ruth made me her primary heir in November. It was not a surprise by then. We had talked about it, carefully, at length, with Daniel present and with full understanding on both sides of what it meant and why. She gave a third to the literacy nonprofit she'd served for 20 years, and a portion to a few friends, and the house and the Michigan place and the remainder to me. She signed the documents at Daniel's office with me sitting beside her and said, when it was done, "Don't change the kitchen." "I won't change anything you wouldn't want changed," I said. "I know," she said. "That's why I picked you." Ruth is still alive. I want to be clear about that because I know how this story sounds, and I need you to understand that the house is not mine yet, and I am not waiting for it. Ruth is 76 with a managed heart condition and a sharp mind and a full life. And she came to my apartment for Thanksgiving dinner last month and ate 2 plates of food and told me my mashed potatoes needed more butter, which they did. My mother was there, and Ka,